Hello, my name is Jean Knudsen, Education Director at White Knitting Machine Company. I'm here to assist you in learning to create fancy patterns in your knitting through the use of the electronics. The patterning device for the White Knitting Machine Model 1602 is called a selection box. It will read geometric or decorative program cards to make designs in your knitting, as well as knit pattern stitches that are built in. The drive shaft connects the selection box to the main body of the knitting machine. The drive shaft is the white plastic peg that spins as the carriage is passed along the needle beds. This in turn spins a belt found inside the selection box on which program card scanners are seated. The scanners move along the belt to read the program cards. It's very important that you connect your selection box to the knitting machine properly. First, find the cursor. It is tightened to the lower slide rail of the back needle bed. The brown knobs on each side of the cursor prevent it from moving when it's not in use. These brown knobs are called cursor stops. You can loosen them by turning them to the right. It's not necessary to remove them. Loosen them slightly, then slide them to the far right and left of the machine. The cursor can now slide freely. Position the cursor to the first needle left of 0. There is a small vertical line in the center of the cursor that you can use as a reference. Place the drive shaft with the flat side down onto the peg at the upper right-hand corner of your selection box. Turn the drive shaft so that the slit at the bottom is sideways. Insert the drive shaft into the opening at the right side of the knitting machine and position so that the selection box is flush with the underside of the machine. Now, while holding the selection box in place, move the cursor back and forth by hand. If the scanners inside the selection box are moving, then it has made a good connection. If the scanners are not moving, remove the selection box and try again. Once the scanners are moving, you may tighten the selection box to the knitting machine with the long white screws underneath. Push up on the screws, then tighten them firmly. Before plugging the selection box in, make sure that it is in the off position. The far right-hand switch is the on-off switch. Make sure that it is in the lower or off position. Then plug your selection box in. The White Model 1602 knitting machine can make fancy pattern stitches in 3 different ways. There are pattern stitches that are built into the selection box, and there are also 2 different types of program cards that come with the knitting machine. The transparent cards are called geometric program cards. The tissue paper cards are called decorative program cards. These 3 types of patterning make this the most versatile knitting machine on the market today. We will begin by discussing the different parts of the selection box and their functions, then work with the 3 different types of designs. In order to start this exercise, make a single bed clothes cast-on. This cast-on will not ravel once the comb is removed and is a quick, easy way to begin knitting. Make this cast-on when you want to practice working with the selection box. The machine is threaded with White Knitting Machine sport weight yarn. The carriage is at the right side of the machine. Press the knit key and set the stitch size dial to 8. Whenever you're doing a single bed cast-on and not starting with rib, you'll always begin in your stocking stitch size, which for this yarn is about stitch size 8. To cast on 50 stitches, use the simple stitch selector to bring every other needle to holding position. Drop the front bed to the lowest position. Place a cast-on comb over the needles in holding position and down between the needle beds. Close the front bed. Push up on the cast-on comb until the bottom of the teeth touch the needles in holding position. Tilt the comb slightly to the back. Place your left hand needle return button in the lowest position. This will cause all the needles in holding position to knit a row, then return to working position 1. Slide the carriage to the left. Pull down on the comb, then hang a medium weight at each side. Bring all needles between 25 left and 25 right of 0 to working position 1. Set the left needle return button to the neutral position, then continue knitting. The cast-on is complete. Let's talk for a few moments about needle selection and how it works. Manual needle selection is done by hand. Use the simple stitch selector to move every other needle to working position 2. This means that the latch of the needle is level with the flow combs at the top of the needle bed and that the stitch that is on the needle is just behind the latch. Because they are in working position 2, these needles will knit no matter which key you have pressed on the carriage. All of the other needles in the row will follow the key that is pressed on the carriage. If the tuck key is pressed, all needles in working position 2 will knit, while all needles in working position 1 will tuck. You can continue manually selecting needles with each pass of the carriage for as long as you like. To make the same needles knit again, simply move them to working position 2. They will knit, while all of the others in the row will tuck. There will be 2 tuck stitches on every other needle and a single knit stitch in between. Now reverse the needle selection, making the tucking needles knit by bringing them to working position 2, and the knitting needles tuck by leaving them in working position 1. You can create many beautiful fancy stitch patterns this way. This is how the first knitting machines worked. Electronic needle selection was developed to do exactly what had been previously done by hand quickly and easily. The selection box automatically brings needles to working position 2 to knit according to the design on the program card. The black spots on the program card are the needles that will move to working position 2. These needles are said to be selected. All of the needles represented by transparent squares will follow whatever key is pressed on the carriage. These needles are said to be non-selected. In order to knit with the selection box, you must set up the needle beds. First, set up your cursor stops. The cursor stops limit the travel of the cursor across the knitting. Slide the brown knobs of the cursor stops so that they are 15 needles beyond the last needle in working position at each side of the knitting. If you have 25 needles cast on at each side of 0, then the cursor stops will be locked at needles 40. The cursor stop is locked in place by turning the brown knob to the right. Now, as the carriage passes across the knitting, you can hear a distinct click at the end of the row. This is called clearing your cursor stop. Whenever you're using your selection box, you must clear the cursor stop. The cursor will always precede the carriage across the row. It is the communication device between the selection box and the needles. The sharp click tells you that the cursor has changed sides on the carriage, as it must do with every pass. You'll soon get used to listening for this sound with every row. The selection box is composed of many different parts. The switches on the selection box are choices to make in your knitting. They can change the look of your fabric depending on the way the stitches are arranged. From right to left, the switches are on, off. This is simple. Try to remember not to plug in the selection box while it is in the on position. The reverser exactly reverses the needle selection. When the switch is in the upper position or pointing to a black square, all black areas on your program card will knit. All transparent areas will follow whatever key is pressed on your carriage. When the reverser is in the lower position, all needles represented by transparent areas on the card will knit, and all needles represented by black areas on your card will follow whatever key is pressed on your carriage. Most of the time, the reverser will be in the positive or upper position. The row repeat switch tells the selection box how many times to repeat each row of the program card before advancing to the next row. In the center position, you see a single square. This tells the selection box to repeat each row once. In the lower position, you see 2 squares, telling the selection box to repeat each row twice. In the upper position, called Norwegian jacquard, the selection box also reads each row twice, first selecting all of the transparent squares, then all of the opaque or black squares. It is also used as a double row function for all built-in patterns. The next switch has 2 separate and distinct functions. The upper position is called every other needle selection. In addition to the needle selection found on either the geometric or decorative program cards, every other needle in work will be selected to knit. This gives a bird's eye effect to the knitting. This function is also used as a basis for all of the built-in patterns. The center position, represented by a dot, is neutral or off. In the lowest position, shown by an X, the card will hold without advancing. The scanners will read the same row of the program card over and over again, and the effect in the knitting is vertical stripes. The correct name for this function is automatic row advance stop, but it is easier to think of it in terms of row hold. The last switch is called the automatic program card advance and return switch, which is another long name for what is commonly called the impulsor. By pushing this switch quickly up or down, you're moving the program card up or down one row at a time inside the selection box. The indicator arrow shows which way the program card is currently moving. Look at the brown portion of the arrow to discern which way the card is moving. Down means that the card is moving down one row at a time inside the selection box. Up means the card is moving up or out of the selection box one row at a time. The brown knob on the left side of the selection box is called the manual program card advance, and you can use it to turn to different patterns on the program card. The switch in the upper right-hand corner is called the program changer switch. There are two different kinds of program cards that come with your knitting machine: geometric, the gridded mylar sheets, and decorative, the tissue paper cards. Whenever you're using a geometric program card, the switch will be in the lower position. Whenever you're using a tissue paper card, the switch will be in the upper or decorative position. The decorative design adjustment dial is used only when you're using the tissue paper cards. It adjusts the speed of the card as it travels into the selection box, moving it more slowly for finer yarns and more quickly for heavier yarns, so that your design will always be in proportion no matter what kind of yarn you're using. This is an exclusive feature of the white knitting machine line. This will be examined closely as we knit with the decorative designs.